Rain swept across London like a restless curtain, blurring the lanterns that lined the narrow street outside Blytheworth Auction Hall, where Evelyn Harcourt stood waiting for her father with the calm desperation of someone determined not to tremble. She knew the rumors that trailed her family like smoke, debts mounting, creditors sharpening their teeth, a baronet's pride crumbling in plain sight. Yet she held her chin steady, even as two matrons nearby whispered that she would soon discover how cheaply a daughter could be priced when fortune abandoned a household. When her father finally emerged from the hall, his shoulders sagged not with age but humiliation. He avoided her eyes, and that small cowardice pierced her more sharply than any gossip. She sensed the decision had already been made, signed, sealed, and traded away like a parcel. The silence between them stretched until he cleared his throat and muttered that her future had been secured. The word tasted wrong, heavy with dread rather than hope. She understood then that the transaction was complete, that she had become the price for her family's survival. Inside the hall, the low murmur of departing patrons washed over her like a tide of judgment. Evelyn stepped through the doorway and felt the collective gaze shift toward her, assessing, pitying, condemning. She recognized faces from past seasons, ladies who once offered polite smiles, gentlemen who once bowed with courteous approval. Now their expressions carried something colder, as though she had willingly aligned herself with ruin. A pair of young debutantes whispered that the Duke of Blackmore must be desperate indeed. For why else would a man so feared bind himself to a baronet's impoverished daughter? Evelyn had heard of the Duke long before this arrangement. Alexander Hawthorne, a widower scarred by war and shadowed by the mystery of his wife's death, existed in London society like a storm cloud, distant, immense, and dangerous. Some called him a brute fashioned by the battlefield, others insisted he had driven his late Duchess to despair. Evelyn had dismissed such tales as embellishment, yet now they clung to her mind with unsettling force. Was she to live in the shadow of a man haunted by grief, or ruined by it? Would she become another whisper in his legacy? Her father guided her toward the carriage waiting outside, speaking softly of duty, sacrifice and providence, but the words slid past her like mist. She watched his trembling hands and wondered whether he feared losing his daughter or merely the debt collectors at his heels. The carriage door closed with a decisive thud, sealing her fate with chilling finality. Through the window she saw London recede, the city's harsh glow fading into a cloak of fog. She felt as though she were being carried not toward a marriage, but toward a sentence she had not earned. The journey north unfolded in uneasy silence. The driver spoke only to manage the horses, leaving Evelyn alone with the rhythm of wheels and her circling thoughts. Occasionally, she glimpsed the wild countryside stretching in somber hues, as though nature itself anticipated her arrival at Blackmore. She imagined the Duke waiting within his fortress of stone, a man accustomed to authority, expecting obedience from a bride he had never met. She straightened her posture, reminding herself that dignity was her final inheritance. Whatever awaited her, she would not cower before a man simply because the world feared him. As dusk settled, the carriage passed through iron gates that groaned like reluctant sentinels. The vast expanse of Blackmore Manor rose ahead, its windows flickering with pale firelight, its silhouette etched against the storm-thickened sky. Evelyn felt her breath catch, not in fear, but in awe tinged with foreboding. This was a place shaped by grief, a house that seemed to hold its own memories with clenched fists. When the door opened, the butler greeted her with a formality bordering on stiffness, his gaze flicking to her as though assessing whether she would fracture under the estate's weight. He led her through corridors lined with portraits, each one capturing a Hawthorne ancestor with solemn intensity. Their painted eyes watched her passage as though measuring her worthiness. The manor smelled faintly of smoke and old roses, a scent both elegant and melancholic. When Evelyn reached the main hall, she noticed the hush that followed her, servants pausing mid-task, their expressions tightening with unspoken caution. She realized that her presence marked the first change to echo through these rooms in years, and change, in a place built upon sorrow, was not welcomed lightly. Evelyn was still absorbing the room's chill when a quiet shiver passed through the air, a subtle shift that made every servant stiffen. She turned and saw him, Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Blackmore, descending the staircase with the measured steps of a man accustomed to command. The scar across his cheek caught the firelight, a stark reminder of battles fought far beyond these walls. His gaze, dark and unreadable, traveled over her with the scrutiny of someone accustomed to disappointment. Evelyn felt a jolt of defiance rise within her, a refusal to shrink beneath his reputation. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of both authority and restraint, as though every word was forced through a lifetime of guarded silence. He greeted her with a polite inclination of the head, neither warm nor cruel, merely distant, as though he regarded her arrival as an inevitability rather than a choice. Yet something in his eyes flickered, a hesitation, a ghost of surprise that she met his stare without faltering. The butler withdrew, leaving them alone in the hall where the silence pressed. Alexander studied her for a long moment before offering a measured welcome, his tone devoid of pretense. Evelyn answered with equal composure, determined not to reveal the storm beneath her calm. And in that fragile exchange, a quiet truth unfolded. Neither had expected the other to stand so firmly. It was, perhaps, the first crack in the walls surrounding them both. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows of Evelyn's chamber, illuminating the quiet order of a room prepared for a duchess she did not yet feel herself to be. The fire had burned low in the grate, and the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air like an unspoken memory. On the small table beside her breakfast tray lay a leather-bound volume of poetry, its cover worn smooth by prior hands. She had not placed it there. The servants, when questioned, offered only polite evasions, but the truth was clear in the way their eyes briefly flicked toward the east corridor where the Duke's study lay hidden behind a set of carved doors. Alexander Hawthorne had left it for her, though he made no mention of the gesture when she encountered him later that morning in the hall. The book's marked page, an ode to a soldier longing for forgiveness, stayed with her long after he passed by with a curt nod that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Evelyn explored the manor with quiet determination, observing every detail, from the stern stone gargoyles perched above the courtyard to the pale tapestries depicting battles no one wished to remember. She sensed the servants' apprehension whenever she approached the east wing, as though the very air changed its temperament near those locked doors. Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper, guided her through the morning duties of a duchess, but did so with a stiffness that betrayed caution rather than disapproval. When Evelyn gently asked about the forbidden wing, the woman paused, her gaze softening with a kind of pity that seemed dangerous to receive. She answered only that the Duke preferred certain memories remain undisturbed, and it would be prudent not to awaken them. That single statement revealed more than any detailed confession could. The late Duchess's absence had not faded into silence but settled like frost upon the household. By midday, Evelyn found herself restless, feeling caged by the manor's oppressive grandeur. She ventured outside to breathe the crisp northern air, pleased to discover a spirited bay mare in the stables. Against every whispered warning, she saddled the horse herself and rode toward the village, determined to see the land she was expected to rule beside a man who spoke as though every word cost him something he could ill afford. The roads were narrow and framed by wind-beaten hedgerows. As she passed the quiet cottages, their doors cracked open, and villagers peered out, their expressions shifting from curiosity to unease the moment they recognized her. Children were pulled indoors, women lowered their voices, and men stared openly, some with fear, others with suspicion. Evelyn forced a polite smile, though her heart tightened with each cautious step her mare took along the dirt road. She dismounted near the apothecary, hoping conversation might soften whatever fear clung to her new title. Yet before she could inquire about local herbs, a pair of men lingering nearby began speaking loudly enough that their whispers pierced her composure. They spoke of the Duke's first wife, claiming she had begged for mercy on the night she died, her screams echoing through Blackmore's halls. The men did not look at Evelyn directly, they simply continued their cruel tale as though she were deaf or irrelevant. A ripple of humiliation passed through her, not for herself but for the callous delight they took in repeating tragedy. She stepped forward, intending to confront them with measured dignity, but a sudden hush fell over the street. Hoofbeats approached. Alexander Hawthorne appeared at the end of the lane, astride a massive black stallion, his figure stark against the gray horizon. His presence silenced the entire village. As he dismounted, his voice cut through the tension with controlled authority, commanding the men to cease their falsehoods. They obeyed instantly, unnerved by the quiet power in his tone. Evelyn felt the weight of his gaze upon her before he even turned. He asked why she had come alone, his words measured but laced with restrained worry. She replied that she refused to be imprisoned by fear or rumor. He warned her that Blackmore's shadows were not created by imagination. When she countered that he seemed remarkably confident in the endurance of those shadows, his jaw tightened in a way that suggested her defiance stirred something he could not name. The return ride to the manor carried an unspoken tension between them, a mixture of irritation, reluctant admiration, and the raw edge of two paths colliding unexpectedly. Evelyn did not miss the way Alexander rode slightly ahead, as though shielding her from the village's watchful eyes. When they reached the estate, he instructed her not to wander alone again, but she sensed the command lacked conviction. She answered with a cool acknowledgment that fueled, rather than extinguished, his curiosity about her. At her suggestion, and perhaps because he was too surprised to refuse, Alexander permitted a small gathering to be arranged at Blackmore in hopes of tempering the rumors consuming both their names. The preparations unfolded with cautious enthusiasm from the staff, who had not witnessed such liveliness in years. On the evening of the event, candles glowed from every alcove, softening the manor's severe architecture and lending the halls a warmth Evelyn had not thought possible. She moved among the guests with gentle charm, answering questions with honest humility and deflecting cruel insinuations with gracious wit. Gradually, she noticed the shift in the atmosphere. People began to speak to her as though she were a person rather than a scandal. From the balcony overlooking the ballroom, Alexander watched her with an expression she struggled to interpret. The coldness that shadowed him seemed to thaw, revealing something guarded but alive. When he finally descended the stairs, the crowd drifted aside instinctively. He approached her with a formality that belied the intensity in his eyes, offering his hand with a quiet request for a dance. His touch was surprisingly gentle, and though the steps were restrained, the moment carried a charge neither could dismiss. Yet just as Evelyn felt the fragile beginnings of understanding take shape, a malicious whisper slithered into her ear, an aristocrat delighting in recounting the rumor that the late Duchess had died pleading for release from her monstrous husband. The words struck like icy water. Evelyn pulled away, her composure shattering as she fled into the dim hall beyond the ballroom's glow. Alexander followed, his footsteps steady but quick, the air shifting with his urgency. He reached her near the grand window where moonlight pooled across the floor. For a moment he seemed poised to confess something, to let the walls around his heart crack open. But instead, he stopped short, struggling with truths he had carried in silence for far too long. He told her there were matters she was not prepared to know, secrets that would wound her more deeply than rumor. She met his restraint with quiet resolve, insisting that truth was far less destructive than fear. The tension between them hung suspended in the stillness, heavy with everything yet unspoken, and the night ended with a fragile certainty that neither would remain unchanged. A storm gathered over Blackmore that evening, its first distant rumble vibrating through the stone corridors as Evelyn wandered the quieter parts of the manor in search of calm. The ball had ended hours earlier, yet the tension between her and Alexander lingered like smoke from an extinguished candle. She needed air, space to think without the echo of gossip pressing upon her. The manor dimmed around her, lit only by trembling candle flames that cast long shadows along the walls. As she approached the east wing, a faint, rhythmic tapping reached her ears, so soft she wondered if it was merely the storm grumbling against the windows. But the sound persisted, a deliberate, human pulse, like fingers brushing wood. Curiosity tugged at her more strongly than caution. She stepped closer, sensing that whatever lay beyond that forbidden corridor carried the weight of truth. Alexander refused to speak. The door at the corridor's threshold had not been locked tonight. Perhaps a careless servant had forgotten the key, or perhaps fate had grown impatient with the silence between them. Evelyn pushed the door gently, and it opened with a sigh as though exhaling memories long confined. Inside, dust floated like pale ghosts in the air, disturbed by her hesitant steps. She found a room preserved with unsettling precision, dresses hung as though waiting for a woman who would never return, a writing desk arranged neatly, letters stacked beneath a single silver hairpin. The late Duchess's presence lingered unmistakably, a frozen echo of a life extinguished too soon. Evelyn felt a shiver of sorrow, not for the rumored tragedy, but for the lonely grief that had sealed these rooms away. She reached for one of the letters, its ink faded by time, and read only a few lines before a quiet footfall behind her stilled her breath. Alexander stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by lightning that split the sky. His expression held neither anger nor surprise, only a profound weariness that made him seem older than the years etched into his face. He stepped inside slowly, closing the door with a gentle finality that told her no servant had left it open. He had. Or perhaps he had never truly locked away this part of himself, only pretended to. For a long moment they simply regarded each other, suspended between accusation and understanding. Evelyn held the letter steady, afraid to speak yet unable to remain silent. She asked him why he had hidden the truth, why he had allowed rumors to devour his name while he bore them without protest. The Duke's composure faltered. With a quiet exhale, he admitted that the East Wing contained the private suffering of a woman he had loved deeply but could not save. His wife, he said, had returned from the war-torn continent plagued by a melancholy that deepened each year. She withdrew from society, then from him, and finally from life itself. On the night she died, he was not the monster the world believed, but a man powerless to reach her, powerless to prevent her final escape. Alexander confessed that he had allowed public condemnation because guilt felt easier than defending a truth twisted by grief. Evelyn listened, her heart tightening with empathy rather than fear. The scar on his cheek, once a symbol of violence in her imagination, seemed now a mark of battle against both enemies in war and despair at home. As the storm pressed against the windows, he walked toward her with a vulnerability she had not thought him capable of sharing. He told her that he had offered her the poetry book because he recognized something in her, a steadiness, a courage he had not expected. But he had been too accustomed to silence to speak plainly. Evelyn placed the letter carefully back upon the desk and said she did not fear his past, only the distance he allowed it to create. Her voice trembled not from uncertainty but from the weight of the moment. He stepped closer, the shadows softening around them, and admitted he had tried to command his grief as one commands an army, but grief obeyed no strategy. Nor, he added quietly, did she. Their closeness felt both delicate and inevitable. He reached out not with authority but with hesitation, brushing his fingers against hers as though testing whether gentleness still had a place in his hands. She did not pull away. The storm outside intensified, yet inside the room, a rare calm settled between them. Alexander revealed that he had feared her arrival not because she was unwanted, but because she might resurrect emotions he had taught himself to bury. Evelyn met his confession with steady warmth, telling him he had purchased her name, not her will, and that perhaps what he could not command was precisely what he needed most. The following day brought a reckoning neither had sought. Word spread that Evelyn's presence in the village during her earlier visit had revived dormant hostilities. Some accused her of trying to replace the late Duchess, others insisted the Duke's new bride was a sign of his callousness. The whispers grew loud enough to reach Blackmore's gates. Alexander, hearing the slander, rode with Evelyn to the village square, where a small crowd had gathered, their curiosity sharpened into hostility. He dismounted and helped her down, then faced the villagers with a resolute calm that quieted the muttering. He declared that Evelyn was not a shadow cast over the memory of his first wife, but a light he had chosen to allow into a home long darkened by sorrow. His voice held no aggression, only truth. The villagers, struck by the sincerity in his tone, dispersed with uneasy respect. On the return journey, Evelyn sensed a shift within him, a burden easing, a wall softening. When they reached the manor, he walked with her through the courtyard as if reluctant to release the moment's fragile peace. He told her he had grown accustomed to solitude, yet her presence had unsettled him in ways he could neither predict nor resist. She answered that love, if it came at all, could not be commanded, it could only be met. He paused, studying her expression as though it held a future he had not dared imagine. With a voice stripped of all his former restraint, he admitted that from the moment she had refused to bow to his reputation, he had known she was not a purchase but a partner. That evening, Evelyn suggested the east wing be opened fully, not as a shrine to sorrow but as a place reclaimed by life. Alexander hesitated only briefly before agreeing, a final acceptance that healing did not erase memory but transformed it. Together they walked through the once silent corridor as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, pushing back shadows that had lingered too long. It was not a grand declaration, nor a dramatic vow, but a quiet, profound beginning. Two people choosing, at last, to move forward not as prisoner and warden, nor as buyer and bride, but as equals stepping into the uncertain radiance of hope.